API to support that.
So I think this whole area needs to be thought through, because the string that we're tugging on here ends up with ASP.NET not using anything that's on the screen. At which point, why are we doing it? So it sounds like there's a missing piece here.
Yeah, I think there needs to be potentially more thought in terms of like how these updating values will work. But I've been trying to also not add too much complexity right now for the rest of the essentially values and interactions. I think it's a little bit more of a layer that we can add in terms of supporting options that mutate.
So I recall talking about this a bit in the past, and I remember concurrency limit was a thing that was brought up as tricky when config changes. Yes. I remember talking to you about that, John, and you were the one who brought that up. And I think though, for like what you were saying is like for some of the rate limiters and stuff, if ASP.NET middleware reacts to like an iOptions monitor change, we could probably create a new rate limiter instance to use for the middleware with the new options for certain things. That might not work for concurrency limiting, but something to consider.
Yeah, the concurrency was tricky, particularly because its accounting is very exact, and it is triggered off of release, which is why I think I originally said it could be tricky. But I think essentially dealing with new incoming requests is not so bad. It's just this case of like if you increase the limit, then we should start processing the queue again, or any queued requests, which yeah, that needs a notification of some sort.
So I think it's fine to say, we're not currently going to support the mutating scenarios, but if that's the case, then we should revisit, like, concurrency limiter option should be sealed and none of its properties should have setters.
Right. So yeah, the reason why I didn't make it sealed and have setters is to kind of suggest that we can do these mutable options, but we can start off with them sealed for this iteration, and then we can talk about designs on how to support mutable options. Like we can start that discussion, but we can also proceed with these APIs first.
All right, so we're making all the options type sealed,
and removing,
or at the very least, the ones that don't work well with mutation once the limiter has been created should be sealed with no setters. Right? It should be you construct the limiter options, and after that point, the values don't change. For the ones where you have designed it already to be fully mutable, it sounds like some of these are, then while I generally prefer things to be sealed by default unless there's a good reason, it doesn't have to be.
I think we can just start off with all of them sealed and see where the implementations, like once they do support it, we can unseal them and make them mutable.
Also, I mean, separately, it begs the question, for something like concurrency limiter options, if the pattern is you're just passing data into a constructor and everything is only gettable, is there a reason to just not construct the concurrency limiter with those settings? Not have an options pass all?
I think that, I mean, that's a possibility. But I mean, again, part of this was to kind of suggest that you can use the default implementations with other types of options.
Sorry, I didn't understand that. You can use what with what?
So essentially, the things we ship inside this assembly would be these options, but theoretically, ASP.NET can extend a concurrency limiter option and have it mutate based on configs and stuff like that. But I think
well, but they can't, because we just sealed it and made all the properties get only.
But yeah. So I think essentially having config-driven options can be designed for later, and we can just seal them for now.
Rephrasing what you're saying, John, I think you're saying in the long term, you believe we will add necessary surface area to concurrency limiter options to support mutability, to support notification when something changes. And so the right middle ground right now is to ship it as sealed, immutable, but later we'll remove those constraints.
Yeah, and I need to essentially think about the scenario, like essentially in ASP.NET Core, yeah, we will definitely use, extensions options, or essentially figure out how to make that work well. But in cases where, you're just working with runtime bits, it doesn't make sense to have a dependency on options. I would say no, because theoretically we want these to be usable inside the BCL, which is where we hope to eventually put it. So having it depend on extensions options is not a good idea.
So on that note, I do have a higher level question. You've mentioned a couple times ASP.NET extending stuff here, maybe shipping its own implementations. That makes me a little nervous if we're saying, here are default implementations, but ASP.NET can't use them, because that then suggests that we're shipping things that, if ASP.NET can't use them, why can anyone else use them, right? Or are they going to also have to create their own because of this or that constraint they have? So what are the special situations that would cause ASP.NET to need to create its own, and how is that not the common case?
I think it'll depend on integration with other, libraries. So, for example, ASP.NET Core essentially sits on top of extensions and all of that, so we can make use of extensions concepts such as config and options and stuff like that. But we don't want it to be so that you can only use rate limiters if you have those concepts. So can we have like a slimmed down version where it has fewer dependencies, but maybe the options are not mutable, for example? Okay. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. If we end up in a world where, how do I say this? I would be sad if we shipped these types, supported in whatever form we eventually end up supporting them, and ASP.NET is unable to use them. Or more generally, everyone ends up needing something special in the implementation such that no one can really use the ones we ship out of the box.
Fair enough.
So, I'll re-ask a question Steve asked, which is, if right now the way that you're expected to use concurrency limiter is new concurrency limiter of new concurrency limiter options of specify all the options, how about we get rid of the middle new and just delete all the options type and make them parameters or constructor parameters, and then when we have support for an options type that is dynamic and all of these things, then add it then.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, essentially.
Wait.
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. So would we be using this with IOptions though? Like in the middleware? Like that doesn't require like a new concrete implementation of the limiter, right?
It would
How do you flow the updates into it?
Yeah,
IOptions monitor.
Well, you can't.
So
it's a constructor parameter.
Right, you can't.
But you can't with them being get only and sealed.
Yeah, it would be middleware, right? So the middleware would be taking the IOptions monitor of rate limiter options, whatever.
Right, but how do those updates get passed to the rate limiter?
I think
does
we'll
the
need a
rate limiter
wrapper.
You would recreate the rate limiter for the ones where you could.
Essentially,
But I mean,
yeah, essentially, I think that's what that is, which is we have a wrapper for these implementations that and then in that wrapper it would take in an options class, and when those options changes, it creates a new instance of these limiters, and like essentially goes through its, I guess, all the queued requests and move them over to the new I guess concurrency limiter, for example.
How do you get access to the queued requests?
You would need to track everything that's in there, I would assume. Essentially shim, or essentially have a bunch of so in the wrapper, before it returns the task that's being awaited, it would have some kind of accounting to track all of the currently outstanding requests.
Yeah, like if we wanted to make it separate, like constructor orgs, you could hoist everything to like middleware options, and maybe that's okay. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so
yeah,
we're flattening all the options into constructor overload or into constructors.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we were on concurrency limiter options. Did we want to move on to token bucket?
All right, so I think for token bucket we already had the comment that it shouldn't mix the naming of permit and token. So.
Right. Yep.
Again, with the flattening on the constructors, are we at all worried about like too many constructors? I mean, isn't that the normal reason for the options pattern? Is we decide we want to add more configuration later, and then we just end up with too many constructors?
Right. So mind you that in this case it's a little bit different, being that most of these values are required. So for example, concurrency limiter, you need to specify all three.
So,
right, but like when we add one,
right.
Like,
so my
like a new optional thing.
My guess is, and I guess the way that I was proposing the suggestion is that in this V1y previewy whatever-y thing, it's flattened parameters. And if V1 goes stable and never got support for the, update notification options types, etc., then that ships. When something comes along later, either it's a constructor overload to add the new thing, or at that point the options types have been worked out and there's now two constructors, one that takes the rich options type and the other takes the flat static parameters. And if you want whatever the new feature is, it's only on the new dynamic type, and that's that. But it's sort of the like, if we ship the options type now before we understand what the options type needs to do to fulfill its long-term vision, then we may end up with two constructors anyway. So.
But this like guarantees we end up with two constructors. Like, don't we want to like be closer to the final shape of the API that we would want?
Put another way, what are the drawbacks of having a options class and only one constructor that takes in the options class?
I mean, having the options type be a sealed type with get only properties, it's just, you look at it and it's like, the way that I build one of these things is new thing I want options of all the parameters. Why do I need to specify this other thing in the middle? So it's just the usability looks weird. If it makes sense in the average consuming scenario here, that you would have built some options and you're using them across multiple instantiations, then that would be a reason to have the type. If it's you expect that in the next, like right after whatever V1 is, you think that there are going to be 6 more options that you want on one of these things, and maybe the options type is already justified now. But looking at it from when we talk about future plans, they often never come to fruition. what's the options type really bias?
Okay.
Like, so I'm fine either way. Like, I'm just asking the question. Like, fewer types means fewer things that people have to think about, and that's why I suggested just squashing it, just usability, etc. If there's scenarios to already have the types now, then fine. If you think that you can implement the notify semantics on them later, then that is a reason to maybe go ahead and do it. I just ask questions.
So
yeah,
like the direct constructor args don't do notification either. So I guess I just don't see the downside of sealed options types. Like we use it like in, for SSL stream and a lot of things where you just have a lot of options. And I think given the design space here, like the future, like the ability to not have a ton of constructor overloads is nice. And I just don't see the downside, maybe. Is the new type really that costly? I don't know.
I mean, really, again, it's just a question of, is it just noise? For the SSL stream, there are a lot of options. Many of them don't need to be specified. I believe it does I have some required things and then settable properties for optional things, and this is everything is required except auto replenishment on the token bucket rate limiter. Like at that point, it's like if everything's required, why are you invoking two things?
right. So I mean, in the token bucket limiter, which is up next, there is already a optional parameter, or at least that is one of the possible designs. So so there is a case for having these optional parameters, but in this case, there's really just one. Yeah, I think it depends on like whether it's better to be a bit more future-proof. I think like we can also just try out the implementation, see whether we identify newer parameters and whether a option is warranted. Well, personally, I think I do prefer having option classes as well, which is why I proposed it here. But in terms of simplicity, I'll defer to your opinions if you feel that collapsing them down to a constructor is better to start.
Do you have thoughts, Emo?
I mean, not really.
Okay. I mean, sometimes you have insights from usability studies of when people comment that things feel unnecessary. So,
I mean, I get the argument for both sides. I think the problem is like, I'm not an expert in this domain, so it is very speculative, right? That's why I think, when I said earlier we should ship a preview and see what happens, right? I mean, I would generally, like as a principle, I would shoot for less pieces and then just see how people react to them, because you generally don't get feedback that there are too many pieces, right? So if you think it's worthwhile cutting things down and then only add it when customers complain, I think it's probably easier to ship with fewer pieces in V1, or I should say V preview, right?
Perhaps, but I would actually like to kind of argue that having these options, though yes, you do need a new limiter of new options, it might be better than eventually having this bifurcation of multiple constructors as well. So like less and like less of what.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think I'll keep these options then. Anyways, I think I'll move on to the actual settings for token bucket rate limiter options.
Okay.
So yeah, the permit limit, queue limit, and queue processing order, those are we've kind of already mentioned those. The three new things are, one is a replenishment period. So this is when does replenishment gets called on the token bucket limiter. And the other, which should be an int, tokens per period, is how many tokens get replenished when replenishment happens. And essentially, those two values, replenishment period and tokens per period, that is that defines your rate in this case. Okay. And I think,
and that's and we already discussed this. It replenishes up to the token limit.
Right.
And is there a model that people can understand about how replenishment and queuing works? Like the queue limit plus the replenishment period? Is the queue limit a hard limit that never grows, or what?
So essentially, you can queue requests up to the queue limit, and when replenishment occurs, if there are queues, if there are requests that are queued, then we will process them in either FIFO or LIFO order, depends on what you configured, and try to satisfy those requests when replenishment occurs.
How are we rectifying permits and tokens here? Like
permits equals to tokens, and then
I know, but it's a token bucket rate limiter that has a permit limit.
It has a token limit.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Should permit limit be named token limit?
Right. Yeah, I'll change that.
Yeah, we had already discussed that one when Steve said it was confusing.
But the base.
There is no base type.
There won't be a base class. It'll just be those properties will be. There will no longer be rate limiter options, and those three values are going to be renamed appropriately for each options class.
Okay, I missed that part. I was gone at the beginning. Okay, that satisfies me then. It's all token.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Similar concepts, but different names. Yeah. And then the next part will be kind of interesting with essentially auto replenishment. So the idea is that by default, the implementation, if it should essentially trigger these replenishments by itself. And how we would probably do that is via a timer. But there's a drawback to that, which is what if you have a lot of token bucket rate limiters to just essentially create a bunch of timers as well, and essentially that being potentially inefficient. So the idea is that we have this option to say whether you should create those timers and track those replenishment yourself, but also for token bucket rate limiters, have a public replenish method that you can call. Essentially, if you let's say you have 100 rate limiters, what you would do is you would set all of those auto replenishment to false, and then have one timer that triggers, and every time it triggers, it calls replenish on all of these limiters. And depending on the different periods that you've configured, you might want to call this every second or call this every, whatever period that you externally control. But it will still respect the replenishment period setting that you have specified, so that if time elapsed since last replenishment period is greater than what you've specified for that particular limiter, it'll do a replenishment. Otherwise, it'll just no op. So that's the idea that, or that's the reason why this auto replenishment property is there to facilitate that. We have had other thoughts on like how that can be achieved, but so far this seems like the simplest and the most, I guess, convenient.
So the concerns that I would, or that I'll raise with that are if you're using one external timer to drive things and it's using the same replenishment period, you can end up with mild skew where the outer timer thinks that, 1 second has passed, but the inner thing thinks only 0.99999 seconds have passed, and now it actually doesn't replenish and you miss a period. I also think it's weird that a method whose name is entirely replenish sometimes doesn't. So, and we've gotten rid of all the setters because we didn't want complex state here. So my recommendation would be that the time span becomes nullable, and null time span means it's externally replenished, and a not null time span means it's internally replenished. But either way, and then you can decide if calling replenish and you gave it a time span is an exception, or if it's just like whatever, bonus replenishment period. But that's how I would do it. Of basically the time span says I'm in control or you're in control.
I see, and essentially, so this goes back to the I guess idea that if you had 100 limiters and one of them essentially is supposed to get replenished once every second and one replenishes every minute, the external I guess method needs to know which one should be replenished at the 1 second mark and which one should be only replenished every minute.
That is the thing that seems natural to me. I could be wrong, but that.
I mean, I think that works. It's just then you'll need to kind of have a mapping of like limiter to time span, whereas this essentially, like the idea is to kind of decouple that a little bit and have the replenishment period always set and auto replenishment determine whether that is being checked externally or internally. So I think, again, like this is probably just an alternative way of representing it, and it shifts the responsibility of who keeps track of these replenishment period around. Should that be on the limiter or should that be external? It will be even simpler to make that an external responsibility, but I think that makes it harder to use.
Fair. Yeah, I mean, I guess so with the method, which requires jumping ahead a little bit, but the method being just named replenish, like if it was attempt replenish, that could do it, or because the question is if you're this external thing that is just being a single timer doing a bunch of pumping, and you're not knowing or you're not tracking who's supposed to do what, probably you're just going to run through and for each thing do it. But
right,
since depending on what kind of timer you're using, if you're using a leading edge timer trigger, then the amount of time you spend in context switches in your for each loop, or no ops versus actual work in any of the limiters can start throwing off the what looks like the rising edge inside the methods that you're calling. So
right.
The call, to me, it feels like it should really be authoritative. And then the other method would be you allow this time span to be passed in, and then you just expose it on the as a time span on the token bucket rate limiter, so that the caller can match that against its own sense of what it was supposed to do. But anyway, you're going to end up with clock skew in the external thing unless the replenish method is authoritative, and because clocks are hard.
Yeah, I would say that this really should depend on the how these limiters are used. So, for example, if and this is essentially the end creator of these limiters should be the ones aware of how to, I guess, trigger these. I would say that, for example, if you the concern is clock skews, then the these attempt replenish should be called at a frequency that is higher than the actual replenishment period. So essentially, if most of your limiters are, per second, let's say, you should really trigger replenish like once every half second, or probably like once every quarter second or something like that, so that even if you have a little bit of clock skew, you should be able to recover pretty quickly. Now, if the difference is that you have a wide range of replenishment periods, let's say you have services that meet different, I guess, contracts. Like essentially, some limits are, I don't know, 5 requests per week, and other things are like, requests per second. So then in that case, it might make sense to have separate timers for them and just let and assuming you have maybe like 5 different rates that you configure, like per day limit, per second limit, and a per week limit, then it probably makes more sense to have each of them have their own timers, and you don't need to like essentially check everything, all 5 of those limits every half second. So I think it depends on the end user who created these timers to determine whether they want to like create a timer per limit or use one that is common across all of them. And I think this makes that a little bit simpler, assuming we rename the replenish method.
That's fair. I guess, yeah, just having or saying that you'll have docs that suggest if you turn auto replenishment off that you call the attempt replenishment or whatever it ends up with a final name at a multiple times per expected period just to avoid clock skew. I think that would help.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure if we want to go dive right into the token bucket implementation, but we can also just go through the rest of the fixed window and sliding window options because they should be quick.
Yeah. I guess one question, because as I updated a bunch of ints to longs in the notes here, all the permit limit and queue limit should both be longs.
They should be ints. Like, everything should be ints. I realized I copied different parts of this proposal from like different times, I guess, and I didn't update all of the counts, but all of the counts should be ints. We decided to do that, so like, and all the counts are related to each other, so they should all just be ints.
Okay. I think I have that fixed now.
Okay, so let's go with fixed window then. So fixed window is
sorry, back on token bucket rate limiter options. So if we got rid of all the setters, I guess this moves to a default constructor parameter.
Yes.
Okay.
That seems like to be the preference. Okay, so fixed window rate limiter, a brief explanation on what that does. So it should be almost considered the simplest kind of rate limits. Essentially, you define a window, which is a time period, where the permit limit applies. So let's say your time period is 1 second and your permit limit is like 10. That means 10 operations per second. You can change the window to be longer, like operations per day, per hour, anything like that. And the permit limit is just how many operations you can do in that window. And the implementation, on the implementation side, essentially you track the beginning of the window as well as the count that you have seen in this window. And once the beginning of the window is rolls over to like the next window, you reset the count. For sliding window, that's a little bit more complicated in that essentially you split up each individual window into different segments, and then you roll over, instead of rolling over on a new window, you roll over on a new segment. So an example of that, I have an example in the design doc, but I'll just describe it here. Let's say that your window is 3 seconds, and you have 3 segments per window. That means each segment lasts 1 second. So what happens is on each new second, you shift all of the counts that you account for over. Essentially, you add 1 new segment, and then you remove the count of the older segment, and then the total of all of your segment is your count for that window. So I think the original implementation of this, the idea is that fixed window is a little bit too jagged, and this sliding window makes your traffic a little bit more smoother.
And if you wanted pure sliding window, then you would just specify segments per window equal permit limit.
Sorry, a pure sliding window. What do you mean?
If the oldest request that I'm tracking is less than sliding window time, then we're good to go. Basically, that implementation ends up with a linked list of times that you saw things that grows to the permit limit and starts popping things off the head. If you wanted, like, if I look at the request logs at any given time, I should be able to see, we went up to the possible permit limit, and not we hit this artificial chunking of, oh, you were only tracking at half-second windows, so we ended up queuing, even though that one should have ideally been in the previous window.
I see. So in terms of queuing, so in the sliding window case, every time the segments roll over, you essentially get a piece of the permit limit becomes available, essentially.
Right, of however many were in the segment that just got popped off.
Right, but it doesn't mean that you can immediately process, it doesn't mean that the permit limit is completely reset. Right. So it really depends on, essentially how many permits were in the segment that you just popped off.
Right, but if you pass segments per window equal 1, that's basically the exact same as the fixed window.
Right. Yeah. Correct. In which case you probably don't need a sliding window rate limiter. Right. Yeah.
Oh, I see. You even had it previously.
Yeah.
Using properties of the same name, but with a different source. Means I need to copy that one in too.
Right. Yep. Okay. And then it's all of the limiter implementations. And so for concurrency limiter, it is pretty much just implementing all of the parts of rate limiter plus a constructor. So nothing too out of the ordinary. There are a few private things on there. For example, it would have a private release method that gets called in a private class that implements the permit lease, which keeps track of an account, and when that lease is disposed, it'll call release on the rate limiter, but all of those are private. Okay, I think I'll, so then we can move on. Sorry.
Are there any, no is a fine answer. Is there any value in having the object expose what it thinks its current settings are? So either exposing off its options as a property that's just one property, or exposing the pieces. And if, I think that would really only be useful in the debugger, and in the debugger you can step in and look at the internals, but it's just a question.
I would like to say no until proven otherwise, because don't, I haven't found any scenarios where that is useful. Like essentially, once you create a limiter, the only thing that you should really ask it is, hey, can I do a thing?
That's fair. I mean, but like, the base class got, get available permits, and
Right.
so then it's like, well, there's some reasons you may want that in some flows, and otherwise it may just be sort of a semi-diagnostic. I don't think any of these things have a way of reporting how big their queuing state is right now, just because that didn't seem useful at the time, and so it's just
Right.
looking at
Part
the
of
shape
that
here of like there's sort of a suggestion that people really like if they gave a thing in a constructor that they can see it later, so they can line things up with, oh, this is the object that I created here, and it's over here. But if you're only really going to have one, then it's the one, and you built it, and you know what it's doing. So
Right. So, I mean, yes, in terms of like that could be useful, but the scenario that you mentioned, essentially like how big is the queue, what's the health of like how many permits are being used and stuff like that. Those are what we designed the metadata to be, and those values, essentially how many things are in the queue and how many outstanding permits, those are very dependent on the specific moment that you try to acquire something, which doesn't really make sense to be on the options, to be exposed via options, for example. And the options really are just hard limits that you have set in the beginning. I don't think as like even if you as a library, right, you're passed in these limiters, you don't really need to know, or I mean, that's even a little bit more different because you can like sorry, what I was trying to say is as a library, the only concern that you should be having is I want to use these limiters to specified by the user and limit some kind of operation, but you shouldn't base that decision off of like limits that were configured on the
sort of like I could be wrong. I'm just thinking you're past a rate limiter, and if you see that it has a maximum permit count, not even just looking at a current what's available, but seeing that it has a maximum of 30, but you think that you can have work that's represented in the hundreds, then this means that you would need to figure out ways of chunking your work to fit within 30, because 187 is literally never going to succeed. Even if the queue limit said you would have 500, presumably that's going to throw of I will never be capable of fulfilling this request because there will never be 187 free at one time. So seeing things like what's the hard limit, or what's the maximum request that you would support. I mean, I think it would be very weird to be in that state, but it seems possible. And this is it when you're doing a thing where your count represents an amount of work as opposed to, just
right.
the request per second of I'm a request. So
yeah, in that particular scenario, I would argue that there's a miscommunication between the library authors and the end users. Essentially, the library authors should be, clear about what those numbers represent. For example, 180, as you mentioned, that could be bytes, maybe. And if the user specified, you can only ever work on 30 bytes at a time, then yeah, that library is just never going to progress because they can never get those permits. And I think that makes sense. And it's just either the user needs to up their limit, or the library author should be clear that, yeah, we only do chunks of work in 180 bytes, so you better specify a pretty a higher limit, or else I'm not going to proceed.
fair enough. And I don't remember if we talked about it when we did the abstractions, but certainly if I call acquire with -1, that's an argument out of range exception. But if the hard limit is 30 and I call it with 187, what kind of exception are you expecting for that? Because it's not appropriate to be an argument exception at that point, because the general rule is argument exceptions should always be able to be pre-validated.
I see.
So if you can't ask what's your hard limit, then it shouldn't be an argument exception, because you couldn't have known it was going to fail. So argument exception means you should have known this wasn't going to work. Go rewrite your code. And other types of exceptions are, due to a confluence of events, I'm sorry, we cannot proceed further.
So that is a good distinction. I did not know that. And in my proof of concept, I also use an argument exception. But after what you mentioned, I think then it should just be an invalid operation exception.
That's right.
Yeah, that's invalid.
Right. Sorry, what's the invalid operation exception exactly again?
So if you have configured a permanent limit of 100 on the rate limiter, but a request came in via acquire to acquire 180, that's just not going to work because the limiter itself only has a maximum of 100. So we will return an IOE.
And why that rather than immediately returning a lease with his acquired false?
So, I believe. Oh, sorry. Wait, actually, let me check what I.
Oh yeah, I mean, if that's what it does, it's fine. Just it's.
I think I might have. I added the check for that, but I returned false instead of through an exception, and the argument exception is, I think, only for negative numbers.
Okay, yeah, really, it was just if you can't ask what the maximum for a single acquire is, then it shouldn't be an argument exception. If it's return false, then that's fine.
Yeah, let me just double check. I think. Oh, I made it an argument out of range exceptions, but yeah, returning false probably makes more sense. Yeah, I think there might be a distinction on like essentially returning false is almost begging for a retry, but an exception is like, no, just don't even retry. So that could be a distinction of like whether it's throws or not. But I think we can talk about that in the actual implementation PR.
It's fine. I'm just taking the note for that we talked about the exception model, and any implementation detail you want is fine as long as it's not an argument exception, because that violates the argument exception normal usage.
Let's see. Right, I think that was concurrency limiter. For the token bucket limiter, again, it is kind of similar in that it's mostly a constructor plus the implementation of the rate limiter abstractions, plus the public replenish method that we were alluding to earlier. If we don't like the name, we can make it a try replenish and have it return a bool on whether it replenished or not. I think that's an alternative I can think of, although I don't know what the external triggering would do with that bool information.
I mean, depending on what's doing it and whether or not it cares, it would log it.
Yeah, potentially. But essentially the reason why I didn't have it return anything or use a try method is I can't think of why you would need to. Oh, I need to do a public void there. Rookie mistake. Coding in Markdown is, yeah. Anyway, yeah, so
Did we dismiss Jeremy's idea about making replenish authoritative and then having the options take a null time span?
So I feel that that is harder to use because essentially what you need to do is externally you need to map a limiter to a time span. Essentially, you're tracking that information elsewhere, and essentially
How don't
figuring
you
out
need
what.
to do that even with this design?
So with this design, all of the information about like when replenishment occurs is encapsulated on the token bucket options. And what ends up
You're
happening,
externally telling it when to replenish, so you just
you're
always have to
trying to.
replenish it more often than
Right.
what it's configured to.
Yes. So essentially, in terms of clock skew and stuff like that, it is better to essentially trigger these several times per over a period, so that your clock skew don't like skew too much.
Are quote unquote normal people gonna think of that? If they're like, oh, I have 2 of these, I want to not have 2 timers, I just want to base it off a 1 timer. Are they going to know, oh, I should fire that timer more often than the lowest number I put into the 2 limiters?
I mean, that is a recommendation. It's not a hard rule. If in some, I don't know, in some scenarios you might not want to trigger it based on the even the most frequently updated limiter. But
well, if you don't,
then
if you don't, then
might
that
be.
one's not going to be right. Right? If you have 2
it might
of them,
not be
one
completely
is
accurate. It might not be replenishing as frequently as it could be, but maybe that's what you want. Is essentially you only want to update every 10 seconds, regardless of how it's configured. But essentially, in 10 seconds, you might, replenish a token bucket multiple times. That could be what you want to do. I don't see why, or like right now, I think that is really up to the user how they want to do it. We can recommend that if you have multiple token bucket limiters, you should, when you create them, you should trigger their replenishment based on like the most frequently updated bucket and also multiple times of that. But that's a recommendation rather than a hard rule.
just feels like a super advanced scenario that the majority of people are just going to get wrong. Anybody who's going to try this is going to do it wrong for the first time.
I feel also if you're in the advanced scenario where you're triggering these externally, then you should be a bit more careful. I expect most first-time users to just use auto replenishment and end up creating a timer.
Yeah, I mean, because even that's not necessarily accurate. Like if the system's thrashing, timers get laggy.
Right. Right.
Yeah, so I mean, void attempt replenish, bool try replenish, weird things like replenish if able. Able seems weird, but
yeah, none of those words.
Just
like when I was thinking about it, I was like, I don't like any of them. Let's just make it avoid. But yeah, I think bool try replenish might make sense, and then I don't see a use case for that bool really right now. But I mean, I think returning a bool isn't bad per se. Anybody have any opinions of replenish versus try replenish?
I mean, I definitely think if it's not going to replenish, it shouldn't just be named replenish.
I see.
I definitely agree. Like if it's not actually going to do if there's scenarios where it's not going to do what I told it to do, calling it just replenish doesn't make sense.
Could we call it like tick or something?
So the reason why I call it replenish is because like token bucket, I guess the concept generally have like a refill or replenish concept, and I've named all the parameters accordingly, like essentially replenishment period or something like that. So that is why I call this method replenish. In terms of like tick, I think tick, I'm not sure how if that's a very like that's a name with a lot of meaning behind it. But yeah, so I mean, I want to get everyone's feeling on that.
I mean, tick. Yeah, I don't see that being a thing that anyone would find other than the documentation for auto refill saying if it's false, you're expected to call tick, and then you'd be like, well, how often am I supposed to call it? And then that's just like it is very much not a self-describing method. Yeah, so try replenish, attempt replenishment, check replenish, like because the verb is what you want the object to do, right? And so if the verb is replenish, then it should replenish. If the verb is, try, then that means it can fail. If it's attempt, then okay, that's the same as try. If it's check, then that's exactly what you want it to do. Check to see if it's time to replenish. And then if so, do something about it. Actually, you don't care if it does something about it. You just told it needs to check. And so it's the verb should represent the the thing it's going to do. And I don't have opinions on any of the things. Being a zero argument try on the one hand is a little weird. On the other hand, it seems okay. It's just that like there are things going on. It's just dependent upon the state of the object and the state of the clock. And so it's two pieces of ambient state that are merging together, and it tells you what state they were in. And yeah, maybe no one cares about the return value, but it's the try pattern, so it's the try pattern.
I think I like the try pattern instead, and I agree with Eric that replenish sounds authoritative, and it's weird that you call replenish but nothing happened. So I think try replenish and return a bool is probably better in that way.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the rest of the fixed window and sliding window. Last time when I talked about it, I think I mentioned that they should probably also have a replenishment method, but actually I don't think that is the case because these are essentially just depending on your current time and timestamp and whether you should refresh or not. And essentially they should be triggered. Actually,
I mean, it's just all down to logic in acquire and or release, right? So they're triggered by you needing to do something.
Well, the only thing is when you're queued with wait async core, and essentially, how does that get? How does queued processes get triggered or get processed? And actually, I think essentially try or try update window, probably not replenish, but like some other kind of try method is needed to essentially allow external triggering of these window-based rate limiters as well. So essentially all the replenishment and auto replenish properties apply to these as well. But yeah, so I should add those.
I mean, void refresh makes sense to me.
Yeah, okay, and then auto, I guess, refresh.
Yeah. So I mean, but now the question is that now that you've brought up having a manual refresh, does that mean that you want to go back and add the option for should it
Yeah,
like? Because
it
it
should have an option
seems.
for auto refresh.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll be like auto refresh window or something like that, and then try refresh window. Yeah, try refresh window on the limiters themselves. Yeah. So, I mean, another question is, I guess in terms of naming, it's probably better to have replenish for token bucket and uh, refresh for window rate limiters. But they are essentially the same concept. And I'm wondering if we should extract like time-based rate limiter abstraction that provides a singular method for calling refresh or replenish, and having a time-based rate limiter option that has a auto, I guess, replenish or refresh, because they are very similar concepts, and having it the same concept but slightly different names, but does the same thing pretty much, and you work with them in the same way. I'm not sure if that is preferable or having an abstraction is better.
I mean, if you think that there's reusable logic of time-based refresh, then you can certainly add one. But I think now you have to figure out what's the signaling mechanism it's supposed to use, right? So the timer goes off. How's it supposed to notify the derived types that this is the timer event and things? I mean, it could be that it has abstract bool try refresh, and it just calls that. But then you're using refresh instead of replenish on the token bucket one. So it would be reasonable, and but the good news is you can slide it in later, right?
Okay, fair enough.
You can add new base classes, and that's
Okay.
not a problem. So you don't have to solve that today.
Okay. Yeah, then we'll just keep the more limiter specific language, and we can combine them later. Stefan, I think you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just wondering if like the reusable thing was more general than even rate limiters, where it's just like I want to subscribe to like a heartbeat kind of thing.
I mean, that would be periodic timer. But
yeah, I mean, at a certain point, like timer is what you have. But yeah,
right.
But this is supposed to be more efficient than that if you already have a way to call it periodically, right?
Yeah, I think I was looking into patterns of how to subscribe to heartbeats at one point. I didn't find anything authoritative on the subject, so if you have any ideas on how to subscribe efficiently to a heartbeat, or like what are some gotchas and know-hows that we can talk about how that could work. But yeah, that is all of the public APIs for the implementations.
all right, a thing that you said you didn't or weren't sure that you were happy with was, I think, the names of the things in queue processing order.
Yeah. Yeah, like the enum, I don't know if queue processing order is too long or not descriptive enough. And also kind of like process oldest, process newest. I think it conveys the idea of LIFO and FIFO, which is pretty much what we're trying to do here. But yeah, I'm curious if anyone has better ideas of how to name it.
I just wonder if we already have this enum somewhere that can be reused.
So a example of something similar is bounded channel full mode. It has drop newest, drop oldest, and drop incoming, or drop incoming, or essentially conveys the idea that if a bounded channel is full and a new request comes in, which one do you drop, the oldest, the newest, or the incoming one? That is slightly different from this, which is when a refreshment comes in, do you process the oldest or the newest?
Right.
I think the reason for that is any incoming ones, if they already exceeded the queue limit, it makes sense to drop those incoming requests. It doesn't, and also that is very similar to kind of LIFO. So, yeah, dropping the newest and dropping the incoming, it seems very similar, essentially.
Right.
Well, you're never going to have the option. Like, dropping the incoming is always going to happen.
Right.
Because wait async's going to get called, and it's like, well, you're over the limit, and the queue is full. You're done.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right, and that I think makes sense. Like essentially, there's no distinction. Like I don't feel like having a distinction between process newest and not dropping incoming makes sense. Then you're just thrashing on the newest thing in the queue. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is it is functionally different from bounded channel full mode, but it's because I think thrashing on the new request doesn't make sense for rate limiting. So yeah, there is precedence, but I haven't found specifically this like enum.
Yeah, I'm not
so do
seeing
we just not like the name?
anything.
Sorry.
Do we just not like the naming of this, or do we not like how it's called process, or what don't we like about the enum?
Personally, I think queue processing order is a bit long, but I don't know if that's a big concern.
Does it have to have the word queue in it?
Yeah, because I mean, technically speaking, though our priority queue already violated this, but technically speaking, queue is FIFO.
Right.
So,
and I think that was...
So it's really request processing order.
I mean, why not just processing order
or
and
processing
oldest
order.
and newest? You don't even need process in the...
Right.
Because you're already in the rate limiting. It's 2 words, so it's kind of at least not... It's not just one word that we hate.
Yeah, I mean, processing order could be slightly too overreaching in general, but the fact that we don't have one yet is... yeah.
I mean, maybe you still have... Maybe the name of the property is still queue processing order. Because we called it a queue limit also.
Yeah, that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that kind of has to go together. But if the enum is just named processing order, oldest and newest.
Yeah, I also didn't... I called it a queue limit particularly because I don't know what else to call the limit other than queue. Essentially, you want to say like these got kind of like the waiting request limit almost.
I mean, standby. Standby, wait.
Overflow. Yeah. I don't know if I like that either, but
yeah, I found that queue probably conveys like 80% of the meaning, which is, as I've been told, naming should be just 80% accurate.
Yeah. I mean, I think queue processing order is fine.
Okay.
I was going. I can say this, but the person who said it in the chat will just have to take it on faith. I was going to suggest renaming them to oldest first and newest first. That same suggestion came up in YouTube chat. But
I like that.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds pretty good too.
So keep the enum name the same, but the values drop process and put first.
Yeah. I like it.
So why did we drop, or so we're keeping queue processing order as the name of the enum?
Yes.
Okay, and not processing order? Because I like that suggestion. What was the downside? Not enough queue?
If there's a feeling that the property should be called queue processing order to tie it to queue limit, and that the parameter should be queue processing order to tie it to queue limit, then why isn't the enum just called queue processing order to tie it to the queue limit?
Okay, yeah, no, I got it. I missed that probably. Thanks.
Yeah.
So just value affinity. Okay, and now that we have a mostly concrete shape, I will ask, do you think that the processing order is something that people really want to think about, or do they generally want oldest first and it should be a defaulted parameter on all these constructors?
So that's a very interesting question. I would generally say that it might be unintuitive, but for example, in ASP.NET Core, or like in web scenarios, oftentimes you don't really want to do things in order, because if something is waiting in the queue for a while, it's probably already canceled itself. So if you are trying to be fair and essentially always process the oldest one first by default, it might lead to more like failed requests anyway. So that is why essentially LIFO order is pretty is in some scenario better, and it's better to process requests that you think have a likelihood of actually still wanting those results, rather than being very fair. But in other scenario, fairness makes a lot more sense. In terms of like well, not exactly concurrency, but in producer consumer kind of scenarios, it makes a lot more sense to be fair and use process oldest kind of by default there, which is why I don't know if it's a good idea to set a default value for it, because I think it's really dependent on the scenario, and it's better to have whoever's using it to really tell us what they want.
Fair enough. And then similarly, and it sounds like the answer would be no, should there be an enum member, basically the zero value of do whatever you want?
Wait, what do you mean by do? Oh, you mean like a custom queuing order?
No, well, that you're telling the token bucket rate limiter you don't care. Like, queue processing order, I don't care, do whatever you want.
Oh, interesting.
So that would be queue processing order, unspecified or any or default, or yeah, probably default.
In that case, then I think we should be opinionated about which one we do for default, which is something I would like to avoid. But
oh yeah, if you don't think it makes sense, then that's fine.
I mean, there's also an interesting question. I'm kind of surprised that, or like,
also, by the way, you are opinionated because 0 is always the easiest thing to use. You just write the default, and it'll be the 0. So, oldest first is your implicit preferred option.
Right. So theoretically, the enum isn't complete in terms of like you could, instead of just having a LIFO or FIFO order, you theoretically can have an implementation that implements some kind of priority queuing. Granted, in these scenarios, they could be, or essentially in the implementations I've seen, most people just default to one of these, and so we don't. I've not added any like either custom or other or other processing orders in here. Essentially, if you want those, then write your own limiter and implement your own options. Because the default ones that we ship, I think, should just come with FIFO and LIFO and essentially be done with it. So yeah, so that is, I guess, I'm not sure if anyone will question why we didn't have more values, but that's the kind of reason why I kept it to just oldest first and newest first.
That's fair.
Yeah.
All right. Didn't actually mean to be there, so that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we renamed the queue processing order members. We got rid of the rate limiter options base class and lifted everything to the derived types. We removed all the property setters and sealed all the types, or all the option types. We said token bucket should unify on token instead of have a mix. And we talked about some exceptions. We changed replenish to try replenish, and we added what I wrote down was try refresh and auto refresh. So I added auto refresh equal true and a Boolean property, and similar on sliding, and we'll try refresh.
Perfect.
All right. Is there anything we talked about that I didn't write down, or anything else that anybody wants to say on this issue? All right. 5.75 hours plus all the meetings that went into it.
I'm very glad for all the help.
Did we talk about the assembly?
It would be the same name as the namespace, so system threading, rate lifting.
And then that goes for the NuGet package too, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, we had
Yep, good.
talked about that in the previous meeting.
And shipping-wise, you know, you're shipping out of your which repo you're shipping out of?
Our plan is to ship it out of ASP Labs under preview, and then depending on the feedback, we can put it like essentially push it lower down in the stack.
Sounds good.
Alrighty.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Tobe left us, I believe. But Mr. Harder, are you with us?
I'll be doing this,
okay.
But we might need a bit more time than the 10 minutes that we have left.
That was where I was going with the question. So
I have a 10-minute or like a shorter one, I think.
Okay, well, this one is another marked as blocking that we should see if it looks short.
Yeah, of course.
Tobe, I think yesterday said it will take a bit longer because it's
Okay.
the whole stream builder stuff again.
Yeah,
I think I know where this is going, but I think this needs some discussion. So then,
okay.
Miriam, what was yours?
It's the sixth one in the list. logging generator should allow to skip IsEnabled check.
Nice.
And if we do this one fast enough, I also have a relatively small one that would, it's not top-down blocking work, but it would unblock a partner team.
Are you above or below mine?
It's the one literally below it.
All right, so
All right.
let's walk it. All right.
So, Eric, I heard if you're also on the call, this one is just adding a flag for the constructor. Yeah, right there. Just one more, but it's optional. That's the only. So basically, I'll go for the background of why we need it. If you remember, like about skip enable check, overall, when we have a logging generator, if we know that the person who wants to wants us to auto-generate the log method, if they already have guarded their method in a IsEnabled check, then the generator wouldn't need to guard it in an IsEnabled check itself. Therefore, in the way the consumer would let us know to skip that would be through the attribute here. And that's it.
Seems.
This is the same name as the
reasonable to me.
runtime API, right? Just skip enabled check.
Yes.
Makes sense to me.
Approved. I think it would make sense too.
Sorry, I'm formatting things for looking good in the tool. Any concerns? Going once. Sold.
Thank you.
Thank you for having a short one. Okay. So in crypto, which means everybody just stopped listening, in .NET Framework 2.0 or like a 2.0 preview or something weird, there was a bug in how SHA-2 HMACs were computed, and so there's these properties called produce legacy values, and we just ignore them in core, and so marking them obsolete now that we're obsoleting things. And additionally, the HMACSHA1 type had a boolean of should it use managed SHA1 for managed HMAC instead of using native SHA1 for managed HMAC. It turns out we don't even do managed HMAC anymore, we do native HMAC, so this boolean is ignored, and if you're calling it, you should just call the other constructor. So things that have never worked in core that now that we're obsoleting things, we should obsolete.
That makes sense to me.
And I feel like Kevin may have missed HMAC SHA 256, so I'll just leave a note of check that one too. And Demo, we're always using IDs now? Yes?
What do you mean by always using IDs?
All the things we're obsoleting with distinct IDs now?
Oh, yes. I mean, basically the idea is that, yeah, we should just always apply an ID. When in doubt, apply an ID. IDs are cheap.
And use a new ID for... Boom. I like when me typing is the limiting factor.
All right, so for this one, this was originally a different proposal, and Jan eventually said that he thinks we're doing a disservice by not just exposing dependent handle directly. So dependent handle is an internal type that basically means that if one type is being tracked, then the GC should correspondingly track another type. And it's basically what powers conditional weak table behind the scenes. This proposal is effectively take dependent handle and expose it publicly with a couple of tweaks. And then there were 3 small open questions which were largely decided below, but which we should confirm are correct within the concept of API review. Namely, there was push that we should have this be disposable, and therefore free should be disposed. There was a somewhat related question of should we just go ahead and do the same thing on GC handle as well. And then Stephen raised if we're going to have it be free, then should it be a static alloc mesh method instead of a constructor? But given that it was decided we should go with dispose, I'm thinking the constructor should be kept. But otherwise, it's relatively straightforward here. And then the only other question was for target and dependent property, should that be a method, get target independent, or should it just be a property? But it's effectively, as described, relatively straightforward.
I think I would make it a method, if nothing else, so the debugger doesn't accidentally keep it alive every time you hit F10 and you're near it.
That's fair.
I guess if target's already a property, it's already going to keep the target alive.
Can we not do the target independent property?
What do you mean can not?
Like, do we need this, strictly speaking? Because I think instead of doing that, I would either implement the decomposition pattern, so you can directly decompose the handle into target or dependent, or just let people access the individual things.
The reason why it's 2 is because you could conceivably have a tear otherwise. The property can be implemented such that it returns both simultaneously, ignoring any mutations in between. Whereas separate target and dependent returns, you could theoretically call target, mutate 1, and then return dependent, and they would no longer be in sync, so to speak.
And since they're the same type, is it a little more documenting to have a tuple returning property or method than destructuring?
Yeah, so like, I mean, the deconstruct method would do the same thing, right? You could also do it because you basically return it as out at that point.
Would they be named though?
Yeah, they're out parameters.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we typically switch to using tuples for these APIs where we want it to be a logical thing that the JIT can optimize.
I mean, the nice thing with the decompose thing, though, is that if you ever need to add a third one, you can. I mean, I guess you can.
It's never going to happen here. This is a very specialized type, which is why it's in compiler services. That is specifically, it's basically a thing similar to GC handle. It's basically never going to change. It's always going to be a target and dependent here.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, why do they need to be get set?
Because that's how they are today. Dependent handle, as it's used by conditional weak table, allows you to get or set the values. It is not a read-only struct.
Well, but conditional weak table uses this as an implementation.
Right, and ideally we would expose this and then be able to continue using the exact type we're publicly exposing internally. Otherwise, we're kind of defeating the purpose of exposing this publicly.
Fair enough. I'm just confused as to when it would actually update target. Like, I can see a scenario why someone would want to update target. Updating dependent is you've used the override or the overwrite syntax. But when is conditional weak table updating target?
Not sure, but it has the method there, and I'd tell you via source.net, but source.net's still down.
Yeah.
The type is fairly well documented, though, including reasons of like getting the secondary objects more expensive than getting the first, which is why they expose the ability to get just one or the other, or both, etc.
Yeah. So again, like with the properties being properties, if you're in a place that has this object, there's an increased likelihood that you're introducing Heisenbugs, because the debugger is going to investigate target, which is going to prevent it from getting garbage collected, or possibly prevent it from getting garbage collected, which means that dependent will possibly stay around longer. So seeing one of these in the debugger, I mean, certainly they can be marked as non-display, but that then makes them not usable in the debugger. So it just, it seems a little weird, but I don't super duper care. Having the property return a tuple does feel weird. It just feels more methody.
I mean, my bigger concern now is it's just more things to type. If you have a decompose method, you don't have to access the property. You can literally directly decompose it into target independent, which seems a bit cleaner to me.
Indeed, because our answer is, if you're doing this, we expect that the only thing that someone's going to do is decompose it.
Right, but that's natural if you've got a property or method and are returning a tuple.
Oh, but the thing is, if you do the decomposing, you don't have to do dot at all. You literally can just say, var t, d equals dependent handle, right? You just have to type less. Right, because the compiler handles the deconstruct method.
Right, but you can naturally just deconstruct this, right? You can just do var target, underscore equals target independent, and that gives you just the one you want.
Well, handle.target independent. If dependent handle had public void decompose out object target out object dependent, then you would say target dependent equal handle.
Right.
Is there an argument that properties are more visible than deconstruct methods?
I mean, maybe. I mean, I think it depends on how. I mean, this is probably a type where usability isn't the high order bit, right? So it's just, I guess my cat level is lower than I think it is, but.
Right. For this API, it's a extremely specialized type that's going to be getting used by performance-oriented people that are writing things like custom conditional weak tables, and you likely want it to be usable by them and not necessarily friendly for other people, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the premise that like advanced APIs don't need to be nice to use, but like I get it. It's not as important as like dictionary APIs.
Well, it's less about being more easy to use. It's more about, do people who use this API have an intuitive understanding of that you can decompose it, right? And the answer to that might be yes, right? I think that.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel that while having a decompose means we get to avoid the is it a method or is it a property, that if I called the dependent handle, it would look really weird to me to decompose a handle.
Right, and you really want to think of this as a target and dependent, not as other things. And target independent is what was landed on rather than primary secondary in the discussions that happen below between Jan, Mayoni, and the interested parties that are wanting this exposed.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really like either of those names, but don't have better suggestions. So
it's the fairly standard name for this type of thing.
Okay, so this is a mutable struct, which we don't like, but it's a weird thing. And so I assume that this is not backed by a reference thing that makes it safe, right? It's just as unusable as GC handle because it's just as niche as GC handle.
It's a single int pointer.
Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, you mentioned, having this one thing means you can avoid the state where like one of these two changes during that time. It's a mutable struct. It certainly shouldn't be being accessed on by multiple threads.
Likely not, but it's still the way it's set up today in the way that's going to be usable by the parties interested and for conditional weak table itself has the ability to get both simultaneously as well as the ability to get just the primary. The way it's actually implemented by the runtime today is a get primary and secondary method that's an internal call to the JIT.
Meaning it's basically the tuple call, or it's two methods, one's get primary and one's get secondary?
No, it's a single method.
Okay.
Because it's represented as a single int pointer for both handles, and the runtime does magic to make all of that work correctly.
Yeah, I think for reasons I can't articulate, just artistic style, that this feels more like a method than a property, and then ideally these I think would be methods for debugger display reasons, but if being properties makes more sense, then whatever.
They are methods today on the internal dependent handle. The discussion below ended up ultimately landing on properties, but I'm not sure if there was a particular preference there either way. Jan was the one in particular that suggested properties may be more appropriate for all three of them. Couple more up is where Jan said it.
Jan questions the tuple method as well. Okay, apparently even more.
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion here on making sure that this was the correct shape, covering the right things, easily usable, hence the discussion on should this be disposed or should this be free, etc.
Yeah, so I agree that in general a thing that is get set feels like it should be a property, but given the purpose of this and the way that debuggers behave, I would suggest that either that we debugger or tell the debugger display to not show these properties, or we just make them get and set methods explicitly, and everything's a method, so the debugger does not introduce Heisenbugs unless you explicitly call a method on it.
I think that's a reasonable feedback, and we can discuss with Jan which one is the most appropriate he feels. I'd imagine that we could just, worst case, have a debugger display proxy here, just to avoid the issues of keeping things alive, etc. But also, given it's an int pointer, I expect there not to be too many problems.
All right, so should we just go ahead and change them into methods here and see if we need to switch them back later?
I'd probably keep them as properties because Jan's the one that suggested that in the first place, and then raise the concern, and then Jan would indicate if he thinks that's valid and we should just change it to get set, or if he thinks it's not a concern and we should just keep it as the properties.
Okay, but I do, again, we don't have a rule for it, but it's definitely a, I guess we do. It's slower than accessing a field. That the target and dependent should be a method and not a property, because it feels very weird as a property. But mostly that's an artistic feeling.
So my own view here, and I don't think this should block anything, but my own view here is that the only reason people think that it feels wrong is because it's a tuple. If it was a struct and therefore did not expose that there were named properties here, no one would be batting an eye at it. And so I think from that perspective, since a tuple is just a struct, it makes sense that just return a property as if this were an actual named struct. But I also know that there's people that also have the same view as you, including one of the people that wants this API, where they feel that returning a tuple here is wrong from a property.
Yeah, I mean,
that was just my own view of why it feels wrong.
Right, and depending on how much work is involved in accessing dependent, like our rule for properties is, aside from possibly lazy initialization, they're supposed to just be a field access.
Right. And as far as I'm aware, this should largely fall into that category.
Okay.
But Jan and Mayoni would be the expert here on if that's always going to be true, including across like mono, for example.
All right. Emo, do you want to weigh in on the property versus method for the tuple? I know your answer was be a method named destruct or decompose or whatever, but
I would basically just say this type is effectively a tuple, and so you just get to decompose. Deconstruct, I think, is the phrase.
Yeah. All right, so and then I was going to suggest interop services, but apparently Jan suggested compiler services. So
right, and then in particular, the one change is it should be dispose, not free, because we ended up landing on that and then just never updating the original proposal.
It should not be disposed unless it's iDisposable, and if it's iDisposable, it needs to be disposed at impotent, so it should be free.
Okay, fair enough. If Jan has significant pushback here, then that will be raised, with this being very special type and all.
I mean, is the intention to keep this consistent with GC handle?
Well, so that's something that came up in the discussion of GC handle would be incredibly useful for it to have dispose as well. And there was a multi-comment discussion between Jan and Mayoni on the whys and why nots and things like that.
And do those all just apply here?
Yep, it was mostly all the same concepts.
The other thing is GC handle is in interop services.
Which is why I was suggesting interop services, but apparently Jan doesn't want it in interop services, so he suggested moving it out. I'm guessing this went with compiler services because that's where conditional weak table is. I think that's where conditional weak table is. Like, it's in a weird spot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in compiler services. So that's probably why it was internally.
Yeah.
Do we have reasons why, if we're making this public, that it should stay there? To align with conditional weak table?
I think likely because it's namely a special compiler oriented type and not necessarily an interop type. Whereas GC handle is largely it's really an interop type. It's so that you can interact with GC types from outside of .NET. Whereas this is really, let's do something special that's realistically only visible to the runtime, or only possible via the runtime, and its compiler types.
Well, I mean, I disagree with conditional weak table being associated with compilers because I've used it in plenty of things and I've never written a compiler. Okay, that's not true. Scriptsharp was a compiler. But I've
also
never used it in a compiler. But I can agree with it being
the usage case here is like in my weak delegate system, for example, which really has nothing to do with the compiler, yeah.
Right, but unsafe also has nothing to do with compilers, technically speaking, and it's there as well.
Yeah, true.
Like between compiler services and interop services, there's not really a clear definition of what goes where, and maybe we should have shoved a bunch of it in just runtime instead.
I mean, yeah. Runtime actually seems like a... I don't know what's in runtime, but...
Nothing.
I guess there's nothing in system.formats either, but... no, system runtime has apparently ambiguous implementation exception.
Yeah, some GC stuff too. GC settings.
GC latency mode. Yeah, I think runtime.
Yeah, I think that's better, I guess, to tell you the truth, but...
The only thing I really don't want is for this to like get significant pushback from Jan on anything such that it requires a secondary API review.
I mean, the fact that GC stuff is already there, I mean, that's really kind of what this is connected to, right?
Yeah, that's
sort of, kind of. It's like, it's a weak handle between dependent to target. Or is it a strong end?
It's the weak handle. That's why it's powering weak table. Right. This is, I guess, confirming, Tanner. This is as long as target is not garbage collected, dependent is not eligible for collection. But if target goes out of scope, dependent is allowed to be GC'd.
Right.
So this is the... Dear cache, go ask for this. I guess, but target isn't rooted by this object, right?
Right, I believe that's the case.
Right. So it's I have this handle. Hey, if the target hasn't been GC'd yet, then give me the dependent. But basically that's a cache key and a large dictionary. And once people stop talking about the cache key, let the dictionary get reclaimed. That's the way that I've used conditional weak table, I think. So, okay.
So it is about GC-ish stuff, again, because it's a dependent handle. So it feels decent to go with other GC stuff.
Yeah. Hey, a thing that I think we have enough of an opinion on that I can change the code here. All right. So a lot of what we have is a lot of not strong opinions on things.
Yeah, to me it comes across as it basically looks good. There is some open questions where Jan should weigh in and say yay or nay, and that basically influence. And we're good with either yay or nay, but Jan's the ultimate decider there of what is correct because he's the principal architect. And so we'll basically approve it. We'll tag Jan. Jan will say which route we should go on each point, and then we'll implement it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly my recommendation is all of these become methods. Nothing is a property. Well, sorry, is allocated. It's fine. And yeah, but I guess whatever Jan's happy with, I'll shrug at. Aside from renaming free to dispose, that one I'll continue opposing, unless you make the struct idempotent safe, which I don't think anyone wants to do.
Just in my head to make sure I have it right. Like for the target independent naming, like internally in the code we actually named them primary and secondary.
Right, and in the thread below the proposal here, it was discussed at depth on whether primary secondary was the correct name or target dependent, and it was ultimately determined that target dependent is much clearer. And then the alternative of ephemeral is not correct for the given usage here.
So again, I make one of these and it says, as long as this target is alive, keep dependent alive.
That's the high level overview, yes.
Okay, well, at least if I can understand it from the name. Sounds good.
Right, so it makes a GC arrow from target to dependent, but does not make an arrow to target. So once all the arrows to target disappear, dependent may become GC eligible. Depends on whether there are other arrows pointing at dependent. All right, should I call this approved demo?
I probably would.
Okay.
I mean, those other ones could be done through email if we really wanted to, right? Like if it was,
right.
Should it be methods or?
All right. Boom. All right. So, apologies to anyone on the stream. I already apologized in the chat, but apparently when I pushed the start stream button, computers got in the way and decided that it was just going to create a placeholder stream and not actually stream. So in the beginning, where I showed off reload to restore this page, the new API review public calendar based on a public suggestion. Huzzah! APIreview.net/schedule. And since it's new, I'll just confirm. Emo, we don't have a meeting on Thursday?
So I've not set up anything yet for Thursday. So I thought the idea is that we go back to once a week. And I think given the backlog, that seems not unreasonable unless people feel like it is.
It's fine with me. I think we're like the things we didn't get to here are like they're not going to get in today, and there's not really a reason to get Thursday versus Tuesday. So I think we're good for seeing people on the 22nd at 10 a.m. Redmond time as always. And following my recent formula, I now observe that we are over our schedule or over our allotted time, and I declare this meeting adjourned. Ciao.
Bye-bye.